She was in row 23 when the captain's voice cracked over the intercom with words that would change everything. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a serious situation aboard this aircraft. Alina Moskov had been settling in for what should have been a routine 6-hour flight from Denver to Frankfurt, but the terror in the pilot's voice told her that her military training was about to be put to the ultimate test at 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Flight 847 had departed Denver International Airport on schedule at 2:47 p.m., carrying 312 passengers and 18 crew members on what was supposed to be an uneventful transatlantic crossing. The Boeing 777-300ER was one of the airline's newest aircraft, equipped with state-of-the-art navigation systems and safety equipment that made commercial aviation statistically safer than driving to the grocery store. For most passengers, the 8.5-hour journey would be nothing more than an uncomfortable but manageable experience in cramped economy seating. Alina Moskov was not most passengers. The 28-year-old former Navy SEAL had chosen seat 23F specifically because it provided optimal sightlines throughout the cabin while positioning her near emergency equipment and alternative access routes. Her military training had made situational awareness an unconscious habit, and even on civilian flights, she automatically assessed threats, escape routes, and tactical advantages that might become crucial in emergency situations. The past 18 months had been a period of adjustment for Alina as she transitioned from active military service to civilian life. After completing one of the most challenging SEAL training programs in naval history, she had served 3 tours of duty in specialized operations that remained classified even after her discharge. Her personnel file was filled with commendations and decorations that told the story of exceptional service under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her current assignment was far less dramatic but equally important to her personal mission. As a security consultant for international corporations, she specialized in threat assessment and crisis management for companies operating in hostile environments. The trip to Frankfurt was part of a consulting contract with a multinational energy company that needed expertise in protecting personnel and assets in politically unstable regions. The flight had begun normally, with the usual pre-takeoff procedures and safety demonstrations that most passengers ignored while Alina paid careful attention. She had noted the locations of emergency exits, life vests, and oxygen masks, while also observing the behavior and positioning of flight attendants who would be crucial resources in any emergency situation. Her trained eye had automatically cataloged potential weapons, improvised tools, and defensive positions throughout the aircraft cabin. During the first hour of flight, Alina had settled into her usual travel routine of reading technical manuals while maintaining peripheral awareness of passenger behavior and crew activities. The aircraft was climbing smoothly toward its cruising altitude of 41,000 feet, and the pilot's initial announcements had been routine updates about weather conditions and estimated arrival times. Nothing had suggested that this flight would be any different from the dozens of others she had taken for business purposes. The passenger manifest represented a typical international flight mix: business travelers heading to European meetings, tourists beginning vacation trips, and families visiting relatives abroad. Most were absorbed in their own activities, reading books, watching entertainment systems, or trying to sleep despite the cramped seating conditions. The demographic breakdown included all ages and nationalities, creating the anonymous crowd that characterized modern commercial aviation. What none of them knew was that among the seemingly innocent passengers were 3 individuals whose presence would transform a routine flight into a life-or-death crisis. Hidden within the normal mix of travelers were trained operatives whose mission required taking control of the aircraft for purposes that had nothing to do with reaching Frankfurt safely. Their planning had been meticulous, their timing carefully calculated, and their methods designed to overwhelm the aircraft's security measures before anyone could respond effectively. The captain's voice over the intercom at exactly 4:23 p.m. marked the moment when everything changed. Captain James Mitchell had 22 years of commercial flying experience and had handled countless emergency situations with professional calm and competence. But the tremor in his voice as he made his announcement told Alina immediately that this was no routine mechanical problem or weather diversion. Ladies and and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Mitchell's voice carried obvious stress despite his attempts to maintain professional composure. We have encountered a serious security situation aboard this aircraft. I need all passengers to remain in your seats and follow the instructions of the flight crew immediately. Do not attempt to move around the cabin or use electronic devices until further notice. The announcement sent ripples of concern throughout the passenger cabin as people began looking around nervously and whispering to their traveling companions. Flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, their training evident as they began implementing emergency protocols while trying to maintain calm among increasingly anxious passengers. The professional demeanor of the crew provided some reassurance, but the captain's obvious distress suggested that the situation was far more serious than a typical in-flight emergency. Alina's military training had prepared her to recognize the signs of a developing crisis, and everything about the current situation suggested a security threat rather than mechanical failure. The captain's specific mention of a security situation combined with restrictions on passenger movement indicated that the crew was dealing with potential hijacking or terrorist activity. Her pulse remained steady, but every sense was now operating at maximum alertness as she prepared for whatever might come next. From her position in row 23, Alina had excellent visibility throughout most of the aircraft cabin while remaining inconspicuous among the other passengers. Her training had taught her to gather information before taking action, and she began systematically observing passenger behavior for signs of who might be responsible for the security situation the captain had described. The ability to identify threats quickly and accurately would be crucial in determining her response to whatever was about to unfold. The security situation that Captain Mitchell had announced became terrifyingly clear within minutes of his initial warning. 3 passengers who had seemed completely ordinary during boarding and takeoff suddenly revealed themselves as coordinated operatives whose mission was to seize control of Flight 847 for purposes that had nothing to do with reaching their scheduled destination in Frankfurt. The first indication of organized threat came from row 8, where a man in his 30s had been quietly reading a business magazine since takeoff. Without warning, he stood up and produced what appeared to be an improvised weapon from his carry-on luggage, addressing the cabin in heavily accented English that suggested Eastern European origins. His demeanor was calm and professional, indicating extensive planning and training rather than desperate amateur terrorism. "Ladies and gentlemen, this aircraft is now under our control," the man announced with chilling authority. "My name is Viktor, and I have associates positioned throughout this cabin. If you follow our instructions exactly, no one will be harmed. If you attempt to resist or interfere with our mission, people will die." His weapon, clearly constructed from materials that had passed through airport security, demonstrated sophisticated preparation for this operation. Alina's trained eye immediately began assessing the tactical situation developing around her. Viktor's positioning in row 8 gave him command visibility over most of the forward cabin, while his mention of associates suggested coordinated positioning throughout the aircraft. Her SEAL training had included extensive counter-terrorism scenarios, and she recognized the hallmarks of a professionally planned hijacking operation rather than impulsive criminal behavior. The second operative revealed himself from row 34, near the rear of the aircraft where he could control passenger movement toward the back emergency exits. This man, who appeared to be in his 40s with the weathered appearance of someone accustomed to violence, held a similar improvised weapon while scanning the cabin for potential threats to their operation. His eyes moved systematically through the passenger seating, evaluating each individual for signs of resistance or law enforcement training. "I am Dmitri," the second hijacker announced. "All passengers will place their hands on their heads and remain absolutely still. Anyone who moves without permission will be considered a threat and dealt with accordingly." His tone carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again if their operation was threatened. The third member of the hijacking team emerged from the first-class cabin where premium seating had provided him with access to flight crew and aircraft controls. This individual appeared to be the operations leader, carrying himself with military bearing that suggested extensive combat experience and tactical training. His weapon was more sophisticated than those carried by his associates, indicating his senior role in whatever mission they were executing. "My name is Kazimir, and I am in command of this operation," the third hijacker stated with absolute authority. "This aircraft will not be proceeding to Frankfurt. We have a different destination in mind, and we will reach it safely if everyone cooperates completely with our instructions." His calm professionalism was more terrifying than emotional outbursts would have been, indicating careful planning and ruthless determination. Alina processed the tactical information with military precision while maintaining the appearance of a frightened civilian passenger. 3 operatives positioned strategically throughout the aircraft suggested coordination and planning that went far beyond amateur terrorism. Their weapons, though improvised, appeared functional and potentially lethal. Most importantly, their positioning controlled key areas of the cabin while limiting passenger options for resistance or escape. The flight crew's response indicated that they had been trained for exactly this type of scenario, but their options were severely limited by the hijackers' strategic positioning and apparent willingness to use violence. Flight attendants moved carefully through their sections of the cabin, following the terrorists' instructions while trying to maintain calm among increasingly terrified passengers. Captain Mitchell's voice had not been heard since his initial security announcement, suggesting that the cockpit was now under hostile control. Passenger reactions varied from shocked silence to barely controlled panic as the reality of their situation became clear. Parents instinctively moved to protect their children, while business travelers stared in disbelief at the transformation of their routine flight into a life-threatening crisis. The aircraft's confined space and high altitude made escape impossible, leaving everyone completely dependent on whatever these men had planned. Viktor began moving through the forward cabin, collecting passenger cell phones and other electronic devices that might be used to communicate with ground authorities. His method was systematic and professional, suggesting previous experience in controlling hostage situations. Each passenger complied meekly with his demands, understanding instinctively that resistance would result in immediate violence. Dmitri maintained his position near the rear exits while scanning for potential threats among the passengers in his sector. His eyes moved professionally from person to person, evaluating each individual's potential for resistance based on physical appearance and behavioral cues. When his gaze reached row 23, it lingered momentarily on Alina before moving on, apparently satisfied that she posed no immediate threat. The aircraft's course had begun to change subtly, indicating that Kazimir had successfully gained access to the cockpit and was directing Captain Mitchell to alter their flight path. The deviation was gradual enough to avoid triggering immediate attention from air traffic control, but Alina's military experience allowed her to detect the change in engine sound and aircraft attitude that indicated they were no longer heading toward Frankfurt. As the hijackers consolidated their control over the aircraft and its passengers, Alina began formulating tactical options for response. Her SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario, but the confined space, civilian passengers and high-altitude environment created unique challenges that would require careful planning and precise execution. The lives of over 300 people now depended on decisions she would make in the next few critical minutes. From her position in row 23, Alina conducted a systematic tactical assessment of the hijacking situation while maintaining the appearance of a terrified civilian passenger. Her SEAL training had taught her that successful counter-terrorism operations began with thorough intelligence gathering, and the confined aircraft environment provided both advantages and severe limitations for any potential response she might attempt. The 3 hijackers had positioned themselves strategically to control key areas of the aircraft while minimizing their exposure to coordinated passenger resistance. Viktor in row 8 commanded the forward cabin and had access to first-class passengers who might include air marshals or other security personnel. Dmitri near the rear controlled movement toward back exits while maintaining overwatch of the economy section where most passengers were seated. Kazimir's position in first class gave him proximity to the cockpit and flight crew. Their weapons appeared to be ceramic or composite construction that had successfully passed through airport security screening. The devices looked functional and potentially lethal, though their improvised nature suggested limited ammunition or striking capability. More importantly, their positioning indicated that the hijackers were prepared to sacrifice themselves if necessary, suggesting ideological motivation rather than simple criminal intent seeking ransom or escape. The aircraft's current heading had shifted approximately 15 degrees from their original Frankfurt route, indicating that Kazimir had successfully coerced Captain Mitchell into altering course toward an unknown destination. The change was subtle enough to delay detection by air traffic control, but Alina's military experience allowed her to recognize the deviation from normal flight patterns. Time was becoming a critical factor as the aircraft moved further from friendly territory. Passenger demographics presented both opportunities and challenges for any resistance effort. The majority were civilians with no combat training or experience in crisis situations, making them potential liabilities in any confrontation with armed terrorists. However, the sheer number of people aboard meant that coordinated action could potentially overwhelm the hijackers if properly organized and executed with sufficient surprise and violence. Alina identified several passengers who might possess useful skills or training based on their behavior and physical appearance. A man in row 18 maintained military bearing despite the crisis, suggesting possible law enforcement or military background. Two women in the middle section showed signs of professional training in how they observed the hijackers and positioned themselves protectively near children. Their calm demeanor under extreme stress indicated potential allies. The aircraft's layout provided limited options for movement and tactical maneuvering. The narrow aisles restricted rapid deployment, while overhead storage compartments created obstacles and potential hiding places. Emergency exits were under hijacker control, eliminating escape options and forcing any confrontation to occur within the confined passenger cabin where collateral damage would be inevitable. Flight attendants continued following hijacker instructions while subtly communicating with each other through hand signals and positioning. Their professional training in emergency procedures made them valuable assets, but their primary responsibility was passenger safety rather than tactical operations. Any plan would need to account for their safety while utilizing their knowledge of aircraft systems and emergency equipment. The hijackers' communication patterns suggested a well-rehearsed operation with predetermined roles and contingencies. Viktor's movement through the cabin collecting electronic devices followed established protocol for controlling information flow, while Dmitri's stationary overwatch position indicated discipline and tactical awareness. Kazimir's absence from the main cabin suggested he was coordinating with cockpit crew or monitoring aircraft systems. Alina's military experience included extensive training in confined space operations, but aircraft hijacking scenarios presented unique challenges due to altitude, pressurization, and the presence of innocent civilians. Any violent action that damaged critical aircraft systems could result in catastrophic decompression or loss of flight control, potentially killing everyone aboard regardless of the hijacking outcome. The terrorists' apparent professionalism suggested they had contingency plans for passenger resistance and were prepared to escalate violence if their control was threatened. Their positioning allowed mutual support between team members while creating crossfire zones that would endanger civilians in any confrontation. Successful action would require eliminating all three operatives simultaneously to prevent retaliation against hostages. Time factors were working against any potential rescue operation as the aircraft moved further from friendly territory toward whatever destination the hijackers had planned. Commercial aviation fuel roads provided limited flight duration, suggesting their target was within several hours of the original flight path. Once they reached hostile territory, passenger survival prospects would diminish dramatically regardless of cooperation with hijacker demands. Communication with ground authorities was impossible due to the confiscation of passenger electronics and apparent hijacker control of aircraft communication systems. Air traffic control would eventually notice their course deviation, but military response options were limited once the aircraft left controlled airspace. Any resolution would need to come from within the aircraft rather than external rescue operations. Alina began formulating preliminary action plans based on different scenarios and timing considerations. Her training had emphasized the importance of overwhelming violence applied with perfect timing and coordination. In the confined aircraft environment, hesitation or partial success would result in massive civilian casualties as the hijackers retaliated against passengers they held as human shields. The decision point was approaching rapidly as the aircraft continued toward its unknown destination. Alina's SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this type of high-stakes situation where split-second decisions would determine whether hundreds of people lived or died. Her assessment was complete, and now she needed to choose between remaining passive and hoping for the best or taking action that could save everyone or get them all killed. The moment of decision arrived 37 minutes into the hijacking when Viktor began selecting passengers for what he described as additional screening procedures. His systematic approach to choosing victims sent waves of terror through the cabin as people realized that cooperation might not guarantee survival. Alina watched with cold calculation as the terrorist's selection criteria became clear. He was targeting passengers who appeared to have military or law enforcement backgrounds. Viktor's first selection was the man in row 18 whose military bearing had caught Alina's attention during her initial assessment. The passenger, who appeared to be in his 50s with the weathered appearance of a career soldier, was ordered to stand with his hands behind his head while Viktor conducted what appeared to be an interrogation about his background and potential threat to their operation. "You have the look of military," Viktor observed in accented English, pressing his improvised weapon against the man's neck. "What is your service background? Are you active duty, intelligence, special operations?" His questions were professional and methodical, indicating extensive training in identifying potential threats among seemingly innocent civilians. The passenger's response was carefully neutral, claiming to be a retired accountant with no military service, but his posture and bearing contradicted his words. Viktor's reaction was swift and brutal, a strike to the solar plexus that dropped the man to his knees, gasping for breath in the aircraft's pressurized atmosphere. The demonstration of violence sent a clear message to other passengers about the consequences of deception. "Ladies and gentlemen," Viktor announced to the cabin, "we know there are trained personnel among you. Military, police, security specialists who think they can interfere with our mission. You have seen what happens to those who lie to us. Anyone with tactical training will identify themselves immediately, or we will find you and the consequences will be severe." Alina's mind raced through tactical calculations as she realized that her military background made her a target for elimination rather than an asset for survival. The hijackers were systematically identifying and neutralizing potential threats, which meant that remaining passive was no longer an option for anyone with the training to potentially stop them. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly. From her position in row 23, she could see that Viktor's interrogation process would inevitably reach her within the next few minutes. His methodical approach through the cabin meant that she had perhaps 10 minutes before being forced to either reveal her SEAL background or attempt deception that would likely fail under his professional scrutiny. Either option would result in her elimination as a threat to their operation. The aircraft's course deviation had become more pronounced, indicating that they were now heading toward a destination that was definitely not Frankfurt. Captain Mitchell's voice had not been heard since the initial hijacking announcement, suggesting that cockpit communications were under complete terrorist control. Ground authorities would soon realize that Flight 847 was no longer following its filed flight plan, but military response options were limited at cruising altitude over international waters. Passenger morale was deteriorating rapidly as Viktor's interrogation process continued with increasing brutality. Each person he questioned was subjected to physical violence regardless of their answers, demonstrating that cooperation would not guarantee survival. The psychological effect on other passengers was devastating, as they realized that their fate was no longer in their own hands. Dmitri maintained his overwatch position near the rear of the aircraft, while monitoring Viktor's interrogation procedure. His eyes continuously scanned the passenger compartment for signs of coordinated resistance or individual attempts at heroic action. When his gaze occasionally settled on Alina, she maintained perfect civilian composure while internally preparing for combat that seemed increasingly inevitable. Kazimir
emerged briefly from the first-class cabin to consult with his associates about the interrogation process.
His appearance provided Alina with crucial intelligence about the terrorists' coordination and command structure. The brief conversation between hijackers was conducted in what sounded like Russian or Ukrainian, suggesting Eastern European origins and possible state sponsorship for their operation. The aircraft's passenger manifest included citizens from multiple countries, making this an international incident with complex political implications. However, the hijackers' systematic approach to eliminating trained personnel suggested that their ultimate goal was not political negotiation, but rather ensuring that their mission could not be stopped by passenger resistance. This made their intentions potentially more sinister than simple terrorism. Flight attendants continued providing basic services under terror, but their movements were increasingly restricted as the hijackers tightened control over all aspects of aircraft operations. Their professional training in emergency procedures made them valuable sources of information about aircraft systems and safety equipment, but their primary concern was passenger welfare rather than tactical operations. Viktor's interrogation had reached row 20, leaving Alina with approximately 6 minutes before her own encounter with the terrorist screening process. Her SEAL training provided multiple options for response, but each carried significant risks for civilian passengers who would inevitably become collateral damage in any violent confrontation. The confined space and pressurized environment made traditional military tactics extremely dangerous for everyone aboard. The decision matrix was becoming clear: remain passive and hope that her civilian disguise would survive professional scrutiny, or take immediate action to neutralize the terrorist threat before Viktor's interrogation process eliminated her as a potential resistance asset. Her training had prepared her for exactly this type of high-stakes decision where hesitation would mean death for herself and potentially hundreds of innocent people. Alina's hands remained folded in her lap in apparent civilian terror, but beneath that facade, her body was prepared that would determine whether Flight 847's passengers would survive to see Frankfurt or any other destination. The next few minutes would test every aspect of her SEAL training in the most challenging environment imaginable, a pressurized air. At 35,000 feet with over 300 lives hanging in the balance, Viktor's interrogation reached row 21, and Alina knew her moment had arrived. As he questioned a terrified businessman about military service while pressing his weapon against the man's throat, she made the calculation that had been building throughout the crisis. Passive survival was no longer possible. An action was the only option that offered any hope for the passengers of Flight 847. Her SEAL training had prepared for combat in confined spaces, but aircraft operations presented unique challenges that required split-second timing and absolute precision. Any mistake that compromised the aircraft's pressurization or flight controls would kill everyone aboard, regardless of the hijacking outcome. The stakes could not be higher, and there would be no second chance if her initial attack failed to achieve complete surprise and overwhelming violence. The businessman in row 21 was clearly not military personnel, but Viktor's increasingly brutal interrogation methods suggested that his true purpose was terrorizing passengers rather than identifying actual threats. His back was turned toward Alina as he focused on his victim, providing the tactical opportunity she had been waiting for since the hijacking began 38 minutes earlier. Alina's movement was instantaneous and devastating. Years of SEAL training had programmed her nervous system to respond with lethal force when combat was initiated, and every technique she had learned was focused on neutralizing threats quickly and silently. She rose from her seat with fluid grace, covering the distance to Viktor in less than 2 seconds while maintaining complete silence that prevented his associates from detecting her approach. Her attack targeted Viktor's most vulnerable points with surgical precision. Her left hand seized his weapon hand, applying pressure to nerve clusters that instantly paralyzed his grip strength while preventing him from using the improvised blade against passengers. Simultaneously, her right hand delivered a devastating knife-hand strike to his carotid sinus, disrupting blood flow to his brain, while causing immediate loss of consciousness. Viktor dropped like a stone, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the aircraft floor as his nervous system shut down from the perfectly executed carotid strike. The entire sequence had taken less than 4 seconds, and had been conducted with such precision that nearby passengers barely realized what had happened. Viktor was unconscious before his body hit the narrow aircraft aisle. Alina immediately secured Viktor's weapon while scanning the cabin for reactions from his associates. Dmitri near the rear of the aircraft had not yet noticed his partner's elimination, as his attention was focused on monitoring passengers in his section. Kazimir remained in the first-class area, apparently coordinating with cockpit crew and unaware that his team was now reduced by 1/3. The unconscious terrorist presented both an opportunity and a liability in the confined aircraft environment. Viktor was neutralized as a threat, but his body in the aisle would quickly attract attention from his associates once they attempted communication. Alina needed to use the brief window of tactical surprise to eliminate the remaining terrorists before they could retaliate against passengers or damage critical aircraft systems. Passenger reactions to Viktor's sudden collapse varied from shock to dawning hope as they realized that someone was fighting back against their captors. The businessman who had been under interrogation stared in amazement as his tormentor lay motionless at his feet. Other passengers began looking around nervously, uncertain whether Viktor's elimination would improve their situation or make it dramatically worse. Alina's tactical position had improved significantly with the acquisition of Viktor's weapon and the element of surprise that his silent elimination provided. However, her military training emphasized that partial success in hostage situations often resulted in massive civilian casualties as remaining terrorists retaliated against their human shields. She needed to press her advantage immediately, while Dmitri and Kazimir remained unaware of their compromised situation. The aircraft's narrow aisle system created both opportunities and constraints for continued tactical movement. The confined space limited her options for approaching the remaining terrorists, but it also restricted their ability to maneuver or establish defensive positions. Her SEAL training in close-quarters combat provided significant advantages in environments where superior firepower was less important than speed and precision. Flight attendants had noticed Viktor's collapse and were staring in amazement at the sudden change in their situation. Their professional training in emergency procedures would be crucial for managing passenger safety during whatever confrontation was about to unfold with the remaining hijackers. Alina made brief eye contact with the senior flight attendant, conveying through subtle hand signals that she was military trained and attempting to resolve the crisis. Dmitri's position near row 34 meant that Alina would need to traverse most of the aircraft's length while avoiding detection by passengers who might inadvertently alert him to her approach. The terrorist's overwatch position gave him excellent visibility of the main cabin, but his focus on monitoring potential threats from seated passengers had not prepared him for an attack from someone who had already neutralized his partner. The aircraft's continued course deviation toward an unknown destination added urgency to Alina's tactical calculations. Every minute that passed took them further from friendly territory and closer to whatever fate the hijackers had planned for their hostages. Ground authorities would eventually scramble military aircraft to intercept Flight 847, but fighter jets could not solve a hostage situation at cruising altitude without catastrophic results. Alina began moving toward the rear of the aircraft with calculated stealth, using passenger seating and overhead compartments to mask her approach while maintaining the appearance of a frightened civilian seeking a restroom or attempting to check on family members. Her movement had to appear natural and non-threatening while positioning her for a decisive strike against Dmitri before he could alert Kazimir or retaliate against passengers. The next 60 seconds would determine whether her gamble to resist the hijackers would save Flight 847's passengers or doom them all to whatever violent end the terrorists had originally planned. Her SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this type of high-stakes situation, but the aircraft environment presented unique challenges that would test every aspect of her combat skills and tactical judgment. Alina's approach toward Dmitri required extraordinary stealth and timing as she moved through the economy cabin while maintaining the appearance of a panicked civilian passenger. Her route took her past dozens of terrified travelers who watched with barely concealed hope as they began to understand that someone was fighting back against their captors. The challenge was reaching striking distance of the second terrorist without alerting him to Viktor's elimination or her own military capabilities. The aircraft's narrow configuration worked to her advantage as she used passenger seating and overhead compartments to mask her movement while gradually closing the distance to row 34. Dmitri's attention was focused primarily on monitoring seated passengers for signs of coordinated resistance, and his positioning near the rear emergency exits gave him excellent visibility forward but limited awareness of approach from his flanks. Her progress was deliberately slow and methodical, taking nearly 3 minutes to traverse the 25 rows that separated her from her target. Each movement was calculated to appear natural and non-threatening, while internally she prepared for combat that would need to be even more decisive than her attack on Viktor. Dmitri was positioned in an area with better sightlines to his associate positions, making silent elimination crucial to maintaining tactical surprise. 20 feet from her target, Alina encountered an unexpected complication, a young mother with 2 small children who was attempting to comfort her terrified family, while obviously recognizing the significance of Viktor's disappearance. The woman's eyes met Alina's with desperate hope, clearly understanding that some kind of rescue attempt was underway, and wanting to help however possible. "Please," the woman whispered almost inaudibly, "my children." Her plea carried the weight of every parent's nightmare, trapped in a situation where their protective instincts were helpless against armed terrorists who held complete control over their family's survival. Alina's training had prepared her combat decisions, but the presence of children added emotional complexity to what should have been purely tactical calculations. Alina's response was a barely perceptible nod that conveyed both acknowledgement and reassurance while maintaining operational security. Her hand made subtle gestures indicating that the woman should keep her children low and quiet during whatever was about to happen. The brief communication established trust and coordination that could be crucial if the tactical situation deteriorated into general combat throughout the aircraft cabin. Dmitri's weapon was similar to Viktor's improvised, but his positioning and alert suggested greater combat experience and tactical awareness. Unlike his partner, who had become focused on interrogation procedures, Dmitri maintained constant surveillance of his assigned sector while communicating periodically with Kazimir through subtle hand signals. His elimination would require perfect execution with no opportunity for correction or second attempts. The approach vector that offered the best tactical advantage required Alina to pass directly behind Dmitri's position while using passenger seating to mask her final movement. The terrorist's attention was focused forward toward the main cabin, providing a brief window of vulnerability if she could reach striking distance without triggering his peripheral awareness or defensive reflexes. Her final approach began as Dmitri turned his head to check on passengers near the emergency exit doors. The movement provided crucial seconds of reduced visibility that allowed Alina to close the remaining distance while drawing Viktor's captured weapon for potential use. Her primary attack would rely on hand-to-hand combat techniques, but the improvised blade provided backup capability if her initial strike failed to achieve immediate neutralization. Dmitri began turning back toward his normal surveillance position just as Alina reached optimal striking distance. Her attack was instantaneous and devastating, targeting the base of his skull with a precise strike designed to disrupt his central nervous system while preventing any vocal response that might alert Kazimir. The technique required perfect accuracy and timing to avoid simply stunning rather than neutralizing her target. The strike landed with surgical precision, sending Dmitri into immediate unconsciousness as his nervous system shut down from the targeted trauma. His weapon dropped from nerveless fingers as his body collapsed against the aircraft, appearing to sleeping passengers like someone who had simply fallen asleep in his seat. The entire sequence had taken less than 5 seconds and had been conducted with complete silence. Alina immediately secured Dmitri's weapon while scanning the cabin for any reaction from remaining passengers or crew members. The terrorist's elimination had been even cleaner than Viktor's, with minimal disturbance to surrounding passengers who remained focused on their own survival rather than the subtle tactical operation unfolding around them. 2/3 of the hijacking team was now neutralized with complete tactical surprise maintained. The aircraft's course remained unchanged, indicating that Kazimir in the first-class cabin had not yet detected the elimination of his associates. His focus on cockpit operations and coordination with Captain Mitchell provided Alina with continued tactical advantage, but also presented the most challenging target due to his proximity to flight crew and aircraft controls. Any confrontation in the cockpit area could potentially compromise flight safety for all passengers. Flight attendants had begun noticing the absence of terrorist activity in the main cabin. Though they were uncertain about what had happened or whether the situation was improving or becoming more dangerous. Their professional training in crisis management made them valuable allies, but their primary responsibility was passenger safety rather than tactical operations. Alina would need their cooperation for the final phase of her operation against Kazimir. The young mother who had witnessed Alina's approach toward Dmitri was now staring with obvious hope and gratitude. Her children safely positioned low in their seats as instructed. Her silent communication conveyed both understanding of the tactical situation and readiness to assist, however possible. The growing awareness among passengers that rescue was underway created both opportunities and risks for the final confrontation with the remaining terrorist leader. Alina's tactical position had improved dramatically with the elimination of 2/3 of the hijacking team. Kazimir's location in the first-class area near critical flight systems meant that the most dangerous phase of the operation was still ahead. Her approach to the cockpit would require different tactics and even greater precision to avoid compromising aircraft safety while neutralizing the final terrorist threat. The approach to first class required Alina to transition from the familiar territory of economy seating to an area where Kazimir held absolute control over both flight crew and aircraft systems. Barriers, 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 Her tactical advantage of surprise remained intact, but the terrorist leader's proximity to Captain Mitchell and critical flight controls meant that any mistake could result in catastrophic consequences for everyone aboard Flight 847. The physical barrier separating economy from first class provided both concealment and strategic challenge as Alina prepared for the most crucial phase of her operation. Through the narrow gap in the dividing curtain, she could observe Kazimir's positioning and behavior while remaining undetected. The terrorist leader was standing near the cockpit door, apparently coordinating with Captain Mitchell about their course deviation toward an still unknown destination. Kazimir's weapon appeared more sophisticated than those carried by his eliminated associates, suggesting both his leadership role and greater access to specialized equipment. His positioning between the cockpit door and first-class passenger seating created a tactical nightmare where any violent confrontation could endanger flight crew, compromise aircraft controls, or result in rapid decompression if critical systems were damaged during combat. The terrorist leader's communication with the cockpit was conducted in accented English that allowed Alina to gather crucial intelligence about their situation. "Captain, maintain current heading toward coordinates I provided," Kazimir was saying. "Any deviation from flight path or attempt to communicate with ground control will result in immediate execution of passengers. Your cooperation ensures everyone survives this operation." Captain Mitchell's response was professional but clearly stressed as he acknowledged the terrorists' instructions while trying to maintain some measure of control over his aircraft. "I understand your position, but we're approaching the limits of our fuel supply for any destination other than Frankfurt. Whatever your plan, we need to consider landing options within our current range capabilities." The exchange provided Alina with vital information about both the aircraft's operational status and the timeline pressure affecting Kazimir's mission. Fuel constraints meant that whatever the terrorists had planned would need to be executed soon, creating urgency that might work to her tactical advantage if she could exploit the psychological pressure affecting their leader. Flight attendants in the first-class cabin were clustered near the galley area, clearly terrified but maintaining professional composure as they followed Kazimir's instructions. Their positioning provided both potential allies and additional complications, as any violent action in the confined first-class space would inevitably endanger crew members who possessed critical knowledge of aircraft emergency procedures. Alina's approach strategy required exploiting the terrorist leader's focus on cockpit coordination while using first-class seating and cabin configuration to mask her final approach. The wider spacing and larger seats in the premium cabin provided better concealment options than economy seating, but also gave Kazimir superior sightlines and defensive positioning if her attack was detected prematurely. The moment came when Kazimir turned his back to monitor Captain Mitchell's compliance with course instructions, providing a brief window of tactical opportunity that might not occur again. Alina moved through the cabin divider with fluid grace, her years of SEAL training allowing her to traverse the distance to striking range in complete silence while maintaining perfect balance despite the aircraft's slight turbulence. Her attack was the culmination of everything she had learned during the most challenging military training program in existence. The combination of speed, precision, and overwhelming violence that SEAL preparation had instilled was focused on neutralizing Kazimir before he could alert the cockpit crew, retaliate against passengers, or compromise critical aircraft systems that kept everyone alive at 35,000 feet. The strike targeted Kazimir's weapon hand first, using a joint lock technique that instantly disabled his grip strength while controlling the direction of his potentially lethal improvised blade. Simultaneously, her secondary attack delivered a devastating blow to his solar plexus that disrupted his breathing and vocal cords, preventing any warning cry that might alert Captain Mitchell to the confrontation occurring just outside the cockpit door. Kazimir's military training was immediately evident as he attempted to counter Alina's attack with professional combat techniques, but his response was compromised by the surprise nature of her assault and the confined aircraft environment that limited his defensive options. The terrorist leader was clearly experienced in hand-to-hand combat, but his skills were no match for SEAL training applied with perfect timing and tactical advantage. The confined first-class space became an arena of deadly combat as Kazimir fought desperately to maintain control of his weapon while attempting to alert his associates who were no longer capable of providing assistance. His realization that Viktor and Dmitri had been eliminated was evident in his increasingly desperate tactics as he understood that his mission was collapsing around him. Alina's superior training and tactical position allowed her to maintain control of the confrontation despite Kazimir's experience and desperation. Her techniques were designed specifically for confined space combat where traditional military tactics were impossible, and every movement was calculated to neutralize threats while minimizing collateral damage to aircraft systems or innocent personnel. The decisive moment came when Kazimir attempted to use a flight attendant as a human shield, demonstrating the ruthless calculation that had made him dangerous throughout his terrorist career. But his movement to seize the crew member created the tactical opening that Alina had been waiting for, allowing her to execute a final technique that would end the confrontation permanently. Her strike was targeted with surgical precision at the base of Kazimir's skull, using the same technique that had neutralized Dmitri but applied with greater force due to the terrorist leader's superior size and training. The blow disrupted his central nervous system instantly, sending him into unconsciousness while his weapon clattered harmlessly to the first-class cabin floor. The elimination of all three terrorists had taken less than 12 minutes from her initial attack on Viktor, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of SEAL training when applied with tactical surprise and perfect execution. Flight 847 was no longer under terrorist control, but the aircraft was still flying toward an unknown destination with compromised flight plans and limited fuel supplies. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom moments later, clearly relieved but confused about the sudden change in his situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We appear to be, the security situation has been resolved. Flight attendants, please report to stations and prepare for immediate course correction back toward Frankfurt. We're going to get everyone home safely." Alina stood among the unconscious terrorists, her civilian clothes disheveled but her military bearing now unmistakable as flight attendants and passengers began to understand what had happened. The specialized training that had seemed irrelevant to civilian life had just saved over 300 lives in the most challenging tactical environment imaginable. The aircraft began its turn back toward Frankfurt as Captain Mitchell re-established contact with air traffic control and requested emergency services upon landing. Flight 847 would reach its original destination after all, but the passengers would carry with them the knowledge that sometimes a single person with the right training could make the difference between survival and tragedy at 35,000 feet. The immediate aftermath of neutralizing all three terrorists left Alina facing the complex challenge of securing an aircraft full of traumatized passengers while ensuring that the unconscious hijackers posed no further threat to flight safety. Her SEAL training had prepared her for post-combat operations, but the civilian environment at 35,000 feet presented unique complications that required careful management to prevent panic or secondary crises. Captain Mitchell's announcement had created a mixture of relief and confusion throughout the passenger cabin as people struggled to understand how their life-threatening situation had been resolved so quickly and completely. Many passengers remained in their seats with hands on their heads, uncertain whether the captain's optimistic assessment was accurate or whether additional threats might still be present among the seemingly innocent travelers. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with professional efficiency, their emergency training taking over as they began assessing passenger welfare and aircraft status. The senior flight attendant approached Alina with obvious respect and curiosity, recognizing that this unremarkable woman in economy seating had somehow accomplished what seemed impossible just minutes earlier. "Ma'am, I'm Rebecca, the senior flight attendant," she said quietly. "Captain Mitchell wants to know your status and whether you need any assistance with." Her careful phrasing avoided specifics that might alarm passengers, but her meaning was clear. The crew needed to understand how to handle three unconscious terrorists and whether additional security measures were required. Alina's response was professionally calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through her system from the recent combat. "I'm Lieutenant Alina Moskov, former Navy SEAL. All three subjects are neutralized and unconscious but alive. They need to be restrained with whatever materials you have available and their weapons secured separately. We also need to search for additional devices or accomplices that might still pose threats." The revelation of her military background sent ripples of amazement and gratitude through nearby passengers who overheard the conversation. The businesswoman who had witnessed Viktor's elimination was staring with undisguised admiration, while the young mother with small children was quietly crying with relief that her family had been saved by someone with the training and courage to act when action was desperately needed. Rebecca coordinated with other flight attendants to gather restraint materials from the air, including plastic zip ties, medical tape, and seatbelt extensions that could be used to secure the unconscious terrorists until landing. The crew's professional training in emergency procedures proved invaluable as they adapted standard protocols to handle an unprecedented situation. The systematic search for additional weapons or devices began immediately, with flight attendants checking overhead compartments, seat back pockets, and lavatories for anything that might indicate additional terrorist preparation or accomplices. Alina supervised the search while maintaining observation of the three neutralized hijackers, ensuring they remained unconscious and posed no further threat to aircraft safety. Passenger cooperation during the search process was complete and enthusiastic, with travelers eagerly opening bags and personal items to demonstrate that they posed no threat to their fellow passengers. The shared trauma of the hijacking had created a sense of community and mutual support that made the security procedures feel like collective action rather than intrusive investigation. Viktor's weapon yielded crucial intelligence when examined more closely. The improvised blade had been constructed from ceramic materials that were undetectable by standard airport security screening, suggesting sophisticated preparation and possible support from organized terrorism networks. The design was professional and deadly, indicating that the hijackers had been serious about using lethal force if their plans were opposed. Dmitri's weapon showed similar construction and lethality, while Kazimir's more sophisticated device included what appeared to be electronic components that might have been intended for aircraft system interference or communication with outside coordinators. The discovery of potentially advanced terrorist equipment raised concerns about whether Flight 847 had been part of a larger coordinated attack on multiple targets. Captain Mitchell's communication with air traffic control had resulted in immediate military escort by fighter aircraft that were now visible through passenger windows as they maintained protective formation around the commercial airline. The sight of military jets provided additional reassurance to passengers that their safety was now guaranteed, while also demonstrating the seriousness with which authorities were treating the attempted hijacking. The The course correction back toward Frankfurt was proceeding smoothly, with fuel supplies adequate for reaching their original destination despite the earlier deviation. Ground authorities were coordinating emergency services for immediate response upon landing, including medical teams for the unconscious terrorists and counseling services for traumatized passengers who had endured a genuine brush with death. Rebecca returned from her consultation with the cockpit crew to brief Alina on arrival procedures and coordination with law enforcement agencies that would be handling the terrorist investigation. The captain says we'll have FBI, German authorities and military intelligence waiting when we land. They want to debrief you immediately and understand how you were able to neutralize 3 armed terrorists single-handedly. The question that everyone was asking directly or indirectly was how one woman in civilian clothes had overcome 3 professional terrorists in the confined space of a commercial aircraft without any of the passengers even realizing that a complex tactical operation was underway. The answer lay in years of the most demanding military training in existence, applied with precision and timing that had saved hundreds of lives. As Flight 847 continued its approach toward Frankfurt with military escort and emergency services coordinated for landing, Alina reflected on how her specialized training had been tested in the most challenging environment imaginable. The skills that had seemed like distant memories from her military service had proven to be the difference between survival and tragedy for every person aboard the aircraft. The unconscious terrorists remained securely restrained and under constant observation, their weapons secured and their identities about to be revealed through investigation that would uncover the full scope of their mission and potential connections to larger terrorist organizations. Their failure had been complete and devastating, turned from hunters into captives by superior training and uncompromising determination. Frankfurt International Airport had been transformed into a massive security military vehicles, emergency services and law enforcement agencies from multiple countries had coordinated. The aircraft's approach was conducted under maximum security protocols, with fighter escort maintaining protective formation while ground-based missile defense systems provided additional coverage against potential external threats. Airport authorities had cleared multiple runways and established secure perimeters that extended for miles around the facility, ensuring that any additional terrorist assets could not interfere with the landing or passenger evacuation procedures. Alina remained with the restrained terrorists throughout the descent, monitoring their condition while briefing Rebecca and other flight attendants about post-landing procedures that would ensure passenger safety during what would inevitably be a complex and lengthy investigation process. Her military experience with post-combat operations proved invaluable in preparing civilian crew members for coordination with law enforcement agencies. The 3 unconscious hijackers had remained stable throughout the flight, but medical examination upon landing would be crucial to determine the extent of their injuries and ensure they survived to provide intelligence about their mission and organizational connections. Alina's precise application of force had been designed to neutralize rather than kill, but the techniques used were inherently dangerous and could have resulted in permanent disability. Captain Mitchell's coordination with air traffic control had provided ground authorities with detailed information about the hijacking attempt and its resolution, allowing intelligence agencies to begin preliminary analysis of the terrorist operation while Flight 847 was still airborne. The speed and effectiveness of Alina's response had preserved crucial evidence and prevented the hijackers from implementing whatever destruction they had originally planned. The landing at Frankfurt was conducted with military precision, with emergency vehicles and security personnel positioned along the runway as Flight 847 touched down under continued fighter escort. The sight of massive security civilization was both reassuring and sobering for passengers who were beginning to understand the full significance of what they had experienced and narrowly survived. German federal police boarded the aircraft immediately upon parking, followed by FBI agents, military intelligence specialists, and medical teams equipped to handle both the unconscious terrorists and any passengers requiring trauma counseling. The coordination between multiple Alina debriefing began before the aircraft doors were opened, with senior investigators recognizing that her actions and observations would be crucial to understanding the full scope of the terrorist operation. Her military background and tactical training made her the most qualified witness to provide professional assessment of the hijackers' capabilities, equipment, and potential organizational support. The initial intelligence briefing revealed disturbing information about the three terrorists that explained the sophistication of their operation and equipment. Viktor and Dmitri were identified as former military personnel from Eastern European countries with connections to international terrorism networks, while Kazimir was linked to intelligence services that had been tracking Western military capabilities and vulnerabilities. Forensic analysis of the hijackers' weapons confirmed Alina's assessment that the devices were professionally constructed and potentially lethal despite their improvised appearance. The ceramic construction and sophisticated design indicated access to advanced materials and technical expertise that suggested state sponsorship or support from well-funded terrorist organizations with significant resources and planning capabilities. Digital forensic examination of electronic devices carried by the terrorists revealed encrypted communications that indicated Flight 847 was part of a larger coordinated attack planned against multiple aviation targets simultaneously. The hijacking's failure had potentially led to a series of attacks that could have resulted in thousands of casualties and massive disruption to international air transportation systems. The passenger manifest analysis revealed that Alina had not been randomly present during the hijacking attempt but had been specifically targeted by the terrorists who had identified her military background through intelligence gathering that preceded their operation. Her SEAL training had made her both a primary threat to their mission and a priority target for elimination during their planned interrogation procedures. Intelligence agencies were particularly interested in understanding how Alina had recognized the developing threat and implemented successful countermeasures without any external support or coordination with ground authorities. Her tactical analysis and split-second decision-making had prevented what could have been one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in aviation history. The broader investigation was revealing connections to terrorist cells operating across multiple countries, with Flight 847 representing just one component of a complex operation designed to demonstrate terrorist capabilities while inflicting maximum psychological and economic damage on Western aviation systems. The hijacking's failure had disrupted years of planning and eliminated key operational personnel. Passenger interviews were providing crucial intelligence about terrorist behavior and procedures during the hijacking, with particular focus on the interrogation methods used to identify potential threats among the civilian travelers. The systematic approach to eliminating trained personnel revealed sophisticated understanding of military and law enforcement capabilities that indicated professional intelligence preparation. The young mother whose children Alina had helped protect during the crisis provided emotional testimony about the impact of having someone willing and capable of fighting back against seemingly hopeless odds. Her account, along with those of other passengers, was creating a detailed picture of how quickly the tactical situation had been reversed through superior training and decisive action. German authorities were coordinating with American intelligence agencies to track the terrorists' entry into Europe and identify any additional operational cells that might still pose threats to aviation security. The investigation was expanding internationally as connections to other planned attacks became apparent through analysis of seized communications and equipment. Rebecca and other flight attendants were providing detailed accounts of the professional coordination and split-second timing that had enabled Alina to neutralize 3 armed terrorists without any of the crew realizing that combat operations were underway until the threats had been completely eliminated. Their testimony emphasized the surgical precision and tactical expertise that had made the impossible seem routine. As the investigation continued into the night, it became clear that Alina's actions had prevented not just the loss of Flight 847 and its passengers, but had disrupted a terrorist network whose capabilities and intentions far exceeded the single hijacking attempt that had brought them into contact with someone whose training had prepared her for exactly the kind of confrontation they had initiated. Up next, you've got 2 more. Stand up. If one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.